In this episode, I'm once again joined by John Myrdhin Reynolds, also known as Lama Vajranatha, writer, teacher, translator, and scholar practitioner of Tibetan Buddhism. John explains his own involvement in Western occult systems, including ordination into the OTO and as a Wiccan high priest, and traces the history of the Western Esoteric tradition from the Italian Renaissance to the present day. John describes how to accumulate magical power, explains the workings of the spiritual world from the perspectives of both Western occultism and Himalayan shamanism, and comments on subjects such as Aleister Crowley, John Dee, Enochian Magick, and more. John also gives a detailed step-by-step description of tantric guardian spirit pujas, compares them to the spirit invocation rituals of Western esoteric systems, and warns against the dangers of working with occult forces without proper protection. So without any further ado, John Myrdhin Reynolds. John Myrdhin Reynolds, welcome back to the podcast.
Pleasure to be here.
I'm so pleased to be talking with you again, and the first episode we did together was enormously well received, and so I'm so delighted to be recording this sequel with you.
Okay, good.
And we left the last episode on something of a cliffhanger, and well, sort of two or three cliffhangers actually. There were lots of cliffs we were hanging off of. One of them was stories about your lamas and your relationships with various lamas throughout your life. Kangyo Rinpoche, Chatra Rinpoche, Dudro Rinpoche, Kala Rinpoche, Gyawa, Karmapa, many others.
Yeah.
That was one cliffhanger. And the other cliffhanger, and I'd like to start here if we might, is your involvement in the Western mystical traditions.
Okay.
Now, I understand you were a third-degree Wiccan high priest, so I'm very curious as to how your involvement in the Western mystical traditions came about. And also, you've done research. In your research, you've compared the Western mystical traditions to Dzogchen, to Bon, and to Tibetan shamanism. And so I'd like to eventually get to that too, if we might, but perhaps we can start with the Western mystical traditions. How was it you first became interested in this, and could you trace your involvement?
Well, first of all, I was not brought up as a Christian. Of course, I grew up in a Christian community in suburban New Jersey, but my mother, she was Irish Catholic originally, but she had left the church by the time she married my father. And of course, my grandmother, she sent me a catechism book and so on with the idea I'd go through catechism and confirmation, but my mother was totally against that. But on the other hand, I did persuade her now and then to take me to the Catholic Church in West Orange, New Jersey, which was a beautiful Gothic building. And I certainly enjoyed the ceremony and ritual aspect of that, this priest wearing this interesting costume and then doing this ritual and speaking this mysterious language of Latin and so on. So aesthetically, I liked that. But my experience with the local Protestant churches was a bit different. The music could be very good, hymns written by Martin Luther or something. But the commercials in between were always too long, these talks by these ministers and so on. So aesthetically, I didn't relate to that at all. And of course, my liking for ceremony and ritual is one of the factors that got me into Tibetan Buddhism. Because in the United States, which is largely Protestant, there isn't so much understanding among American Buddhists why these Tibetans are doing all these elaborate rituals, pujas, all this kind of thing. Whereas Zen, they could really process that, because in the Protestant church, you sit there with your mouth shut. And so, Zen became very popular in the United States. And of course, Tibetan Buddhism became popular because of the great mystique of Tibet, this mysterious land of psychic supermen and so on, out of Doctor Strange, and Mandrake the magician, and the shadow, and the rest of it. But Catholics kind of intuitively understand how energy flows through rituals in a way that Protestants didn't. So anyway, even though I was baptized in the church, actually in both of them, my father being from Episcopalian Protestant background, and his father, my grandfather, having once been a deacon in the church and so on, he insisted on my being baptized first. But as it actually worked out, I got the Catholic baptism before I got the Protestant baptism. But anyway, both times when the priest or minister dumped cold water on me, I screamed and protested, but being just a few days old, they don't listen to you very much. So I sort of grew up then outside the church, and I started having experiences of meeting the spirits, first the water spirits when we were living in Princeton, New Jersey. And they arose out of the water, and they told me that they lived to be beneath the earth, and that they had these jewel-like cities down there. And well, I wanted to go there. So at age 3, I started digging a hole in our backyard, and my mother noticed I disappeared into this hole, and she yelled for help from the neighbors, and they pulled me out of it and so on. And when they told my father about it, I said, oh, they are like reptiles, and they live under the earth. So he thought, oh, they must be dinosaurs. And he took me to the Geological Museum at Princeton University and pointed out the dinosaurs. I said, no, Tyrannus Rex is much too big. No, they were normal size. But he himself, in those days, was a science fiction writer, as well as working in the shipping industry. And he got widely published in the 1930s in these pulp magazines. So we had in the basement a big collection of pulp magazines. I was most into weird tales and read all the Lovecraft stories, when I was still quite young and so on. Still very fond of Lovecraft. But my father had published many other pulp magazines, like 5 novels, and he was a close buddy at one time of L. Ron Hubbard, who founded Scientology after the war. And of course, they had lost contact since the war. But when Hubbard passed away and the obituaries were in the newspaper, my father said, my God, I know him. And he founded a religion. And I remember him telling me when we were sitting in this pub on 3rd Avenue, saying, Jack, if you ever want to make money in America, found a religion, because that's where the money is. Anyway, and later when we moved into more northern New Jersey, we were right on the edge of the forest, and so I was into the forest a lot, and there were the tree spirits there and so on. But I early learned that in America, you didn't talk about these things, because with Christian people, they all think it's the devil. And the scientific people, they all think you're having hallucinations, and they want to get you some help from a therapist or something. So, all right, I had an inner life, kept it quiet. I knew how to work socially in the outer life. And I had my great goddess experience when I was 7 years old. I didn't relate at all to the Christian symbolism, but I related very much to pagan symbolism, because in third grade, when my father gave me Edith Hamilton's Greek mythology, we started reading that, and that I could really get into. I couldn't see this Protestant God who, in the image presented to me, was this stern judge, sitting there in the sky. And he was mainly concerned whether young boys masturbate or not and punish them for doing that. So on. Whereas Zeus, he spent his time chasing after goddesses, nymphs, and human women. This was a kind of God I could relate to. I didn't relate to the Protestant God. And of course, also, my father had a very interesting family. There were many artists in it, and particularly my great aunt Lottie, and we used to go out to Long Island in the summer and visit there. And she had married Joe Gosling, who was a sculptor and one of the designers of for the San Francisco World's Fair, and designed the street lights in San Francisco Chinatown and this kind of thing. And even my grandfather started out as an architect originally and worked for the firm that designed the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. So we had this strong artistic tradition in my father's family, and my father being a literary man, and my great aunt Lottie being a painter and having all these, her house filled with the sculptures that had been done by her husband, got me very, very much into Greek mythology and making images of the Greek gods and so on. So I had that inclination. Now, of course, in the New Jersey suburb, nobody else was interested in that. So this was kind of a within the family, you might say. But I was always fascinated by what was ancient, the ancient times, and by science fiction, what's coming in the future. My father wrote some not so good science fiction stories. In fact, he had the first cover stories for Planet Stories, which was the first, in the 1930s, was the first science fiction magazine. But he wrote, these space operas, like the Golden Amazons of Venus versus the Scaly Ones, and the Princess of the Moon, and things like this. A real Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon type of thing, But anyway, and I like comic books in those days and so on. And of course, as I said, I never read the Bible, but I did read the comic book, so I knew a lot of the stories, about Samson being outwitted by Delilah and all this kind of thing. But I didn't actually get to read the Bible until I had to teach it at the university. And then, of course, I discovered it was fascinating literature, and I still research in these areas. As for anything esoteric, well, in those days, all the scientific magazines and sci-fi magazines would have ads in it from AMORC, the Ancient and Mystical Order of the Rosicrucians, centered in San Jose, California. And so I saw all those ads and so on, but I never sent them any money or something. And but when going through high school, there were some other guys interested in sci-fi, so we used to talk about that. And then I went to Columbia University in New York City, and my interest in Asia only increased, but first of all, in ancient Egypt. But then I came to realize that ancient Egypt was finished 2,000 years ago, and it's gone. What we have left is ruins and art in the museum and so on. But there is still a living tradition in Asia, and I got into Buddhism through reading the Evans Wentz book of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, as I explained last time. And I got involved with theater work, both at Columbia College and also across the street, Barnard College, Gilbert and Sullivan Society. I was in that. I was often a stage manager and designed sets and so on. But I didn't meet anyone into something esoteric then until I went to California, because after failing to graduate from Columbia University and then getting myself exempted from the Vietnam War, so I wouldn't be sent over there, my girlfriend and I, we drove out to California, and then I started meeting many people involved in different esoteric groups, and particularly the Theosophical Society. So I gave some lectures at the San Francisco Theosophical Society, and it was also a valuable connection when I went to India, because my second wife, whom I met at Berkeley, became very interested in Hindu meditation, and she had a teacher in Berkeley, Ishwaran. And when we were going to India in 1969, she asked him who she should see, and he suggested Swami Omkar, who had Shanti Ashram in Andhra Pradesh in South India. And so when we got to India, she went down there, and I went up north to visit for Dalhousie and Dharamsala, make contact with the Tibetans and so on. And then she wrote to me and say, please come down here after you're finished there with the Tibetans, and Swamiji will take care of getting us a permit to stay in India. Because in those days, people from the British Commonwealth, like yourself, had no problem going to India and staying as long as they wanted. But us Americans, Indira Gandhi and her father before that, Pandit Nehru, didn't like Americans very much. And so it was often difficult for us to stay longer than the first 3 months. But there was good karma operating here, because Swami Omkar, turns out, was the Raj Guru for India. His chief disciple was Mr. V.V. Giri, president of India. So he just arranged our residence in India. We didn't even have to go in to see the superintendent of police. He would just send a man out to the ashram and would pick up our passports and return the next day with our residence papers for the year. Later, when I tried to join Vishwabharati University at Shantiniketan in West Bengal, then troubles developed again with Indian bureaucracy. But when we were at the ashram, everything was working beautifully, and then I could take the express train and the Darjeeling Mail and go up to Darjeeling to see the lamas. Anyway, when I was down there as well, I spent some time at Udyar, and just south of Udyar at Kalakshetra, an art school that was connected with the Theosophical Society. And I was also able then to use their air-conditioned library during there. So I had this good relation with the Theosophical Society. So that's one aspect of Western Esotericism. Then when I had to return again to America, of course, I was completely involved at that point in Tibetan Buddhism, with both my Nyingmapa and Karma Kajupa connections. And previously, as I may have explained last time, I set up one of the first Dharma centers in the US before I went to India with Tartan Tuku in Berkeley. And he had done me the good favor of publishing these Tibetan texts and asking me to distribute them to a list of lamas in India. And of course, then this was how I met Kanju Rinpoche, Chato Rinpoche, Dujum Rinpoche, Dojo Chan Rinpoche, etc., these Nyingmapa lamas. Well, anyway, I returned, and the Dharma Center movement had started because Trungpa Rinpoche had come to the US after I'd gone to India. So I didn't meet him until I returned. And at that time, I was traveling with Jawa Karmapa, who was making his first visit to the US and invited to the US by Trungpa Rinpoche. So when we went to Boulder, then I did get to meet Trungpa Rinpoche at that time. And then I had friends who were in his Dharmadhatu organization in New York and so on. Well, anyway, we set up then, later we set up a Kala Rinpoche Center in New York, and for a time I was a chokidar. That is, I was living at the loft, taking care of it and so on, and working part-time for my father and his shipping office. And then finally, Kala Rinpoche sent Lama Norla there. And then everything changed. He started teaching the Ngurndro, which was fine in itself. But then his translator was a lady from Seattle, from a very strong Protestant Christian background. And so the English translation of the Ngurndro sounded like something you heard in a Christian church. And that led me to pull back. And then I made two connections that I met some people who were involved in Wicca and some people who were involved in the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientalis. And one of them, Jim Wasserman, did some advertising work for me, and we became quite friendly and so on. Eventually, he invited me to join the OTO, and originally it was Lashkar Lodge in New York, but then that dissolved for various amusing reasons, and then it his Tahuti encampment was upgraded by Grady McMurtry, who I met at that time, into a lodge, Tahuti Lodge. And so I took a Minerval initiation and became a member of it, although I didn't progress beyond that, because I say my real interest was with the Nyingmapa tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. But we used to meet regularly at that time, and they would stage the Gnostic Mass and so on. I never performed in the Gnostic Mass, but I participated in many of many of these masses and so on. So that was my really only contact with the Masonic tradition in the West, because the OTO was originally started by Rice in Germany, and then when he met Aleister Crowley, he licensed Crowley as the OTO in Great Britain, etc. And later, after Rice passed away, and so at least some of the people recognized Crowley as the head of the OTO. And Jim became very active and moved up in the hierarchy within the OTO. Fine, and as I said, we'd have these meetings in New York, and Grady McMurtry, who was then the outer head of the order, frequently visited New York at that time, and other people who were involved in it, and so on. And so that continued for a time, and Bill Breeze, who also knew separately, but eventually he became Grady McMurtry's successor as the OHO, outer head of the order, and so on. And the last time I saw Bill, which was in Berlin some years ago, he said he still recognized me as a member of the OTO, although I hadn't paid any dues in centuries. So, okay, I liked having that connection with the 93 current and so on, didn't have any problem. Well then, Wicca developed very much in the United States, beginning in Long Island, when Ray Buckland and his wife, Lady Rowan, moved there from the UK. And Ray had received his initiation into Wicca from Monique Wilson, who had received it from Gerald Gardner, the source of this. And I was taking care of the Colorimache loft on West 19th Street. And then on the ground floor, Herman Slater opened up wasn't the Warlock Shop, that was the original name in Brooklyn Heights, but he changed the name to the Magickal Child. And he was right downstairs. So we became very friendly, and I spent a lot of time hanging out there and buying candles, different colors and this kind of thing. And he set up an herb shop in back of this, and among the people being employed there was a lady, Rhea. And of course, Rhea was Rhea was her first name. She had some other last name at that time. But then she and her partner, Carol, they opened up another shop in the East Village on East 9th Street called Enchantments. Now, that was just around the time when I had been teaching these comparative religion seminars at the College of New Rochelle. And at that time, the student body changed and the attendance fell off. And see, I was adjunct faculty. I got to teach a class if enough students signed up for it. And when they didn't, then the class was cut. I was out of a job. Well, I went to Rhea, and she immediately hired me to work in her shop and read tarot cards for people there, and ended up running the CASA, the cash register mainly, and so on. And through her, then I got initiated into Gardnerian Wicca. And so that lineage came down through Ray Buckland, but there was a split there, and it resulted in the witch wars in New York too, where he had gone down to Louisville, Kentucky, and initiated people there. And some of the New York or Long Island people, who were running covens there, didn't recognize people who had Gardnerian tradition from Louisville, which eventually included me because it came through Ed Brzezinski to Lady Mia to me. But anyway, I got my first degree initiation from her, and some years later, second and third. So yes, I am now a third degree Wiccan high priest in the Gardnerian tradition. But that was kind of on the side. And I also used to go to various pagan festivals in the States. That movement had started up, such as Starwood in New York State, and there were others in Maryland and some other places, and give talks or lectures there. And then you get, free admission. Otherwise, you camped out, and so on. It was a great social scene. You met a lot of different people, that way. So that brought me into the neo-pagan scene in the US. And this was also in my interest in comparative religion and the practice of religion nowadays in terms of society and so on. And also then I was studying the Kabbalah, because the main source of ceremonial magic in the West came with the Renaissance, with first the Turkish conquest of Constantinople, Istanbul, about 1458 or something like that. And there were many Greek scholars who fled Constantinople and came to northern Italy, including Firenze, Florence. And they brought the Hermetic tradition with them, the Corpus Hermeticum, and that was translated by Ficino, sponsored by the Duke of Milan. In fact, he requested he do that before the Dialogues of Plato, which in the Greek had also been lost to the West. And so it was brought in. So that was one strain. And then with the completion of the Christian conquest of Spain in 1492, the same year that they said Columbus discovered America, the Jews were, as well as the Muslims, were expelled from the country, and the learned Jewish rabbis in the Kabbalistic tradition also came to northern Italy. So Ficino, who was a clergyman, he translated the Hermetic tradition into Latin, and hence it became available throughout Europe. And he called this method natural magic, because it's seeing the world or the universe as an organic whole, and then different parts of it are in communication with each other in terms of sympathies and so on. And so you can draw down higher celestial powers, into what your activities and your rituals here on Earth through working with correspondences and so on. And the other with was with Pico della Mirandola in Rome, who learned Hebrew and became a disciple of Kabbalistic rabbis and started translating and talking about the Kabbalah and their traditions of magical invocation and so on, using the names of the angels and so on. And so these two were joined together, and then with astrology and alchemy, and it formed then the basis of the Western esoteric and ceremonial tradition. And then Reuchlin and so on brought it up to Germany, and it spread into other countries and into the UK, particularly with Dr. Dee, who was a Welshman, and also he was Queen Elizabeth's astrologer, and he had made contact with the Kaiser Rudolf in Prague, who was a big patron of the Kabbalah and alchemy and all this. Just before the 30 Years' War began, the big war between the Protestants and the Catholics in Central Europe. And so that tradition continued, but then the big change in the 17th century was with the rise of modern science and the modern view of a mechanistic universe and so on with Galileo and Newton and whatnot. And so then that Renaissance tradition went somewhat underground as an alternative culture. So like when I went to the university, I knew all this, so I didn't mention any of my interests in Buddhism and Asian religions or in the esoteric tradition, because I found many correspondences here, such as our work in Buddhist Tantra and the rituals there. There are many things which correspond with the Kabbalah and ceremonial magic from earlier period. And of course, then the esoteric tradition got some revival in the 19th century, particularly with Allan Kardec, first from France, who reintroduced the idea of reincarnation, which had been banned by the church ever since the time of the Emperor Justinian. And then particularly in the latter part of the 19th century with Madame Blavatsky and Colonel Olcott establishing the Theosophical Society. And then in London, the establishment of the Golden Dawn with Westcott and Mathers and so on. And of course, that's where Crowley originally started. And later, these rituals were all published by Israel Regardie and so on. They're now available. And all the secrets seem to keep coming out in public these days, getting on the internet and so on. So I had then also gotten involved in the Western Esoteric tradition, but although my focus was principally on the Nyingmapa and later Bonpo traditions of Tibetan Buddhism.
Gosh, that's a fascinating account. I have several questions, actually.
Yeah.
You anticipated my question about your take on the historical streams that informed Western esotericism in the 20th century. You anticipated that question. What do you, and you mentioned John Dee, what do you make of John Dee's Enochian system that he derived with Kelly in that time period?
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, it is specialized that this was channeling that came through Kelly, looking into that scry stone, seeing the angels and so on. But it is a magical system, and it has been used beyond the system itself, because in Wicca, the invocation of the watchtowers is actually taken out of that. The main source that Joe Gardner used, he had been initiated into a witchcraft group by his friend Daffo, but he was under strict vows not to say anything about it. So that meant he had to create Wicca then. And his main source was, of course, a Kabbalistic text, the Key of Solomon. And so he even used the term athame, which occurs in that text, and so on, and with the emphasis about constructing the magical circle and so on. And he was also somewhat familiar with the Tantra, because the works of Arthur Avalon were already having been published and so on. And there wasn't anything yet really about, Tibetan tantric Buddhism. That really came much later, although Waddell had written his early book about Lamaism and so on, when he set up a temple in Darjeeling and hired a couple of Nyingma lamas to come and do rituals. But he presented a lot of that material as sort of, curiosity and so on, like looking just a little bit into black magic, but not getting involved very, very much with it. And so things became very much what Trungpa Rinpoche called the spiritual supermarket in the West, because we've entered into this age of multiculturalism and so on. So people can draw on different things. And of course, maybe it gets a little too superficial with some versions of chaos magic and that. But this is the scene that's happening these days.
I wonder, with your facility for communicating and seeing various spirits, you mentioned water spirits and tree spirits and so on, and we discussed actually some other anecdotes in the previous episode.
Yeah.
So I wonder, when you began to interact with these Western esoteric systems, some of which we mentioned the Enochian, we could mention the Goetian, other kind of systems, have grimoires of entities of various types, angels and so on, that one can call upon and converse with, or in some ideas bind and so on. And that's something that one can also see a bit of, I think, in the Nagpa traditions of Tibet. All sorts of rituals and so on involved with the Lu and the various different spirits there.
Yeah.
Working with them. How did your, if you want, talent for that side of things interact with this period? Did you attempt to conjure entities? Did you attempt to communicate with them? Did you attempt to bind them or command them, etc., as is sometimes done in these circles?
I was doing contact with them largely through meditation, and I wasn't seeking to bind any spirits as servitors or something like this. I mean, when in New York, there was a time, because my father was away or something, and I was really short of cash and so on, I started doing invocations of goddess Lakshmi. And all of a sudden, then I had a sale to Reader's Digest and got several $100. Whew. When I really needed it, it was when my scene fell apart in Denmark. I had moved there originally because I got into an affair with a Danish woman and we got married at this. And I actually, after the death of my mother, had some money and bought a house there and so on. But as happens often with relations, things come together, but they also can come apart. And when my then Danish wife left, I suddenly found myself owning a house in a country where I didn't speak the language and so on. So I sat down and started doing Ganesha and Lakshmi practice very intensely. And suddenly I was able to sell the house after having recently bought it and make a profit on it and not a loss. Now, it didn't mean then I thought I would be a successful estate agent. No, I mean, the profit actually went to the estate agent that I was dealing with. But the thing is, I felt really blessed by Lakshmi and Ganesha or Ganapati then. But of course, I had met them earlier in India when I was living at the ashram. We read about Hinduism in the West, of course, and the great gods, Vishnu, Shiva, Krishna. And so on. But on the ground in India, it isn't always that way. Where I was, certainly Lakshmi and Ganapati or Ganesha were the most popular deities among ordinary people, farmers, and this kind of thing. So I felt a very strong connection with them. And of course, we also have them in Buddhist practice too, so no problem here. And so I was largely working in that way rather than casting a circle and having a triangle of the art in front of me and trying to get some spirit to manifest in the circle. I wasn't doing that.
And I'm curious, you mentioned Crowley, Gardner, and some others there. What did you think of Crowley's ideas and system? For example, there was quite a bit of crossover in some of his writing, like Book 4, for example, with yoga and yogic, Patanjali influenced yogic ideas and so on. And really quite, as well as his, if you want, view, there was quite a lot of practice there in his system and his approach. Did you experiment with that? What do you make of it? Was it an influence at all?
Well, you know that when Crowley joined the Golden Dawn, his principal teacher was Alan Bennett, who was a definite psychic and so on, and taught Crowley many things. But Bennett was very much drawn to Buddhism and then left and went to Sri Lanka and so on, and actually became, I think, the first British-born Buddhist monk. And later returned to the UK as a Nanda Vidyaya, I think, and was teaching Buddhism there and so on. So, Crowley grew up in the spiritual supermarket like we do, and he found Patanjali Yoga very useful for developing one's magical capacity and so on. And in the Buddhist tradition of Vajrayana, also you develop your magical capacity, mainly through doing sadhana practice, where you transform yourself in your meditation and then in your ritual into a God form, or into a meditation deity, And if your meditation becomes powerful enough, you can access the powers, capacities, wisdoms, qualities, and so on, traditionally associated with that meditation deity, and then use it in your meditation. If you develop that enough, then you can project that energy into your external environment. So in terms of the process, there is first seva, where you are drawing energies into your self through your meditation practice and invocations and ritual and so on. And then secondly, there's sadhana, where you increase your psychic and magical capacity within the vessel of your own body. That's often symbolized by the bija mantra in your heart chakra, which is the essence of your meditation deity, but also of your own consciousness. And then surrounding that is the mantra mala, which looks like a rosary. So it looks something like a hydrogen atom, and it revolves around and generates energy, much like a dynamo in the mountains, you know, turning around and generating electricity. And so you increase your mantra shakti or mantra city or mantric power within your self in the meditation. And then at the third phase, which is called karma yoga, and of course this is a bit amusing now because this term karma yoga in the West has come to mean you do work for some spiritual center or dharma center without getting paid for it. That wasn't the original meaning here. Yoga means unification, and karma means meditation and ritual activity. And when you have accumulated and developed sufficiently your mantra city, you are then able to project it out to bring about effects and transformations within your immediate environment and do such things as healing and so on, but also attract success, prosperity, and so on. So you, in order to be effective in working magic, and that includes if you are going to subdue any spirits, you have to develop your tu or your magical capacity first. And you do that through sadhana practice. Now, when you're doing sadhana, you visualize and think of yourself as the Yidam meditation deity. But when you're doing guardian practice, this is more like a Wicca and ceremonial magic. You have established a sungkor, or a, we would call it magical circle, but it's actually a sphere of protective energy around yourself. And then in front, you can call various spirits. Now, if they're guardian spirits who have been either emanations of enlightened beings, like great bodhisattvas, like Mahakala is, or they have been spirits that have been subdued and converted by some master in the past, such as Padmasambhava or so on, and have taken vows to protect the Dharma and practitioners of the Dharma, then there is no problem. But in the retinues of many of these guardian spirits, there are trekpa, that is, spirits that are still okay, they kind of been subdued and converted, but not too much. And they can become very irritated with you if you don't do things properly. So it's important here to realize these two principles. For example, at every monastery, Buddhist Dabopo and so on, around sunset or evening time, because the spirits become stronger after the sun sets. They do the guardian pujas at that time. The monks all gather, and the principal officiant does the meditation of transforming himself into some powerful figure. Could be Padmasambhava, could be Mahakala. Well, if the spirits come and they see Mahakala looking like something like Arnold Schwarzenegger out of a Terminator film, they are suitably respectful and subdued and behave themselves. But if you just look like you do ordinarily, if the spirits are emanations of great bodhisattvas who are infinitely compassionate and infinitely patient, no matter what you do, they are compassionate and patient. But with these other guys, the lesser ones who come, they are not. They might become offended. Who's this guy calling me here? You know, who's he think he is? All right, let's teach him a lesson, something like this. So that's why you do this ladru first and become a powerful figure before you call any spirits. Secondly, you make sure you always have puja offerings for them. Puja means an offering ceremony, because our relationship with the other world of the spirits, both the lower levels and the higher levels, is in terms of reciprocity, the exchange of energies. We give them energies in terms of the puja offerings we give to them, and then we can expect something in return from them. They can do various things for us. It's like offering bakshish or a bribe or something, or paying rent or something like this. Like when you first do a practice in, say, a new place or outdoors, you first do this kartor practice, the offering of a white torma to the local spirits, and ask them permission to set up your mandala and do your ritual there, or your meditation practice there. And please don't be offended if it seems I'm doing some strange things and so on. It's like paying rent, you know, to temporarily use a flat. So this practice of offering tormas is very important in Tibetan Buddhism. A torma is a vegetarian substitute for a blood sacrifice, for the sacrificing of an animal. Now, when a sacrifice is given, like in ancient Greece, Rome, and so on, they slit the throat of the animal, the blood flows on the stone altar, but that releases the vital energy, or the prana, and the lower spirits feed upon that. The higher spirits, they don't need that. They are up in the higher reaches and so on. God doesn't need your sacrifices. You don't have to sacrifice a goat for him once a year, as they did in traditional Judaism and in Islam and so on, or as they do for Kali, you know, in Calcutta and whatnot. But the lower spirits do feed upon that, and then you've given to them, and so then you can instruct them to do things for you. Now, ordinarily, when you do an elaborate puja ceremony, the sadhana itself always has the ngondro, the preliminary section, the moshi, which is the principal practice, and the J, which is the concluding practices. And in the moshi, or the preliminaries, after the going to refuge and generating the bodhicitta vow, which is the motivation for you doing any kind of Buddhist practice. It's that feeling of compassion for all suffering beings, and your intention for doing Dharma practices is to develop the capacity to help relieve the suffering of all sentient beings in samsara. So that is stated at first. And usually you do that with the visualization in front of you. It may be a single figure, your principal yidam, meditation deity, or it can be the Dzogchen, a much more elaborate figure. It looks like the tree of life with big guru figure in the center of it, and then you have the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas and the Arhats and the Dharma books behind, the meditation deities and dakinis down below, and the lineages of the gurus above. And then before that image, you go to refuge and then generate the bodhicitta. At the conclusion of that, you absorb that projected image, dissolving it into light, you reabsorb it into yourself. That gives you the capacity to transform, because now you transform yourself into a generic wrathful deity, such as Hayagriva, for example. He's a specialist in mantra power and magic and so on. And then if you're practicing for the first time in a new space, whether indoors or outdoors, then you do this Kartor practice. And you have prepared a white torma, which is what Kartor means. Now, as I said, in the old days, in the time of the Buddha, you had many nature spirits, the yakshas in the forest and the nagas in the water. And the yakshas could be quite wrathful at times, and they were often propitiated with blood sacrifices. But the Buddha was totally against this as the unnecessary causing suffering to sentient beings. And so he and the Buddhist Sangha developed the practice of Bali, or in Tibetan it's called torma, which is this vegetarian substitute for a blood sacrifice, for a sacrificial animal. And of course, the Tibetans developed this into a fantastic temporary art with very elaborately sculptured torma cakes. In India, originally made of rice, but in Tibet of tsampa, roasted barley grain. And it's mixed with water and butter and sculptured. And the white torma, of course, is that kept white in their natural color. But then after you have presented the white torma for getting permission to use this space for your practice, to set up the precincts of the mandala. Setting up the mandala in Wicca is what we call casting the circle. And then you have to set up the protections. And so with that, you have the gektor, the obstacle torma. And this is the second torma. The torma you hold on a small plate on your left hand like this, so you show it to the spirits. Now, the obstacle torma is painted red with vegetable dye in order to suggest that it's flesh and blood. And this is then presented to them. And then the spirits are summoned with the mantra. Now, you had two kinds of spirits. You first had the Shidduch, who were the local spirits in that place. You made peace with them. But then you also have the Chungpo, or Bhutas, they're called in India. And even nowadays, that's the usual word in Hindi for a ghost, a Bhut. And they are wandering spirits. They're not bound to a particular geographical location or feature, but they come and go. And so these wandering spirits, so you now invite them and you present them with this torma cake and you tell them how beautiful and delicious, and please partake of it. And of course, some people in the West think, oh, the spirits are stupid. How can they be fooled by this? You know, you're not offering them blood and flesh, you're offering. But the spirits see what you're visualizing, and you've done the ritual first with your meditation, where you have called down and projected into the torma cake higher spiritual energies. You first cleanse the offering by sounding Ram Yam Kam, where you visualize the wisdom fires evoked by Ram, the red wisdom fires coming out of your heart chakra and burning away all the impurities on the torma cake. Secondly, you visualize the green wisdom winds coming out of your heart chakra and blowing away all the ashes of the torma cake. And finally, you visualize the white wisdom waters coming out of your heart chakra and washing away any remaining impurities. So this is the sangha, this is the cleansing of your offerings. And in this case, it's the torma cake. But it could be the whole series of offerings that you have on the altar in front of you. Then the second process of jangwa is purifying. They've been cleansed, now you purify it. Now see, you are still seeing this torma cake with your impure karmic vision. This is a vision you possess because karmically you're a human being in this life, so you see things the way humans do. You don't see things the way a dog does, for example. But you now transform that impure karmic vision into pure vision, which is the way enlightened beings see things. And so you then close your eyes, which simulates a sensory deprivation experience, or shunyata, emptiness. But emptiness doesn't mean nothing at all. Emptiness means the pure potentiality for all possible manifestations, like space itself. If you have something manifesting, there has to be a space for it to manifest. So you then visualize this magnificent poor torma cake, like one of these Western wedding cakes that are 7 stories high. And so this is then what the spirits will see. And thirdly, you do the chinlap, that is the calling down of higher spiritual energies and projecting them into the torma cake or the puja offerings when you sound Om Ah Om, where Om invokes the enlightened body aspect of all the Buddhas, Ah invokes the enlightened speech aspect of all the Buddhas, and Hum invokes the mind aspect of all the Buddhas. And so you've gone through those 3 processes, and then you have the proper offering for the spirits, and then you call them and you present it to them and say, please feed it this. And you see them gather around the torma cake, and their tongues come out and become like long tubes going into the torma cake and drawing up the juice or the nectar of the energy, which is psychic energy, which is projected into the cake, because that's what they're feeding upon. They're not feeding upon the actual material of the roasted barley flour and the vegetable dye, this kind of thing. And then you say, okay, now please be satisfied with this. Now go away, return to your own places, and don't cause us any problems in the future while we're doing our practice here. But some of these spirits maybe aren't satisfied. They're recalcitrant. They're kind of difficult in this. So at that point, you have to manifest yourself as a wrathful deity. And so you hold up in your right hand your dorje or vajra, or else the three-bladed dagger known as a purba, and you show that to them. And then you threaten them that if they don't go away and don't and cease to cause problems, then they will be smashed with this vajra or purba, and their heads will be crushed, and so on. So then you have to have the mantracity to be able to intimidate them and make them go away, so they're not just sitting there laughing at you. So then you have dispelled all negative energies, and you erect around yourself the sumkor from the seed syllable. Say hum, for example, in your heart chakra. The blue rays of light come out, and on the tip of each a ray of light, there's a vajra dorje, a diamond-like scepter, and then this creates a sphere. As I say, it's more than a magical circle, because it's not just in every direction, but above and below also. And that creates, and then sounding ram, you invoke the wisdom fires, which the seed syllable ram drops out of you, down below your protective sphere, and that syllable gives birth to the fires of wisdom, which rise up, and these fires completely surround the protection sphere, or sumkor. And then as a third level, you can also have guardian spirits outside the fires, facing outward, bearing various weapons. So if any negative energies or evil spirits approach, they will be attacked by these guardian spirits. They'll be burnt up by the fires of wisdom, and they won't be able to penetrate your protection sphere, which is made of diamond, which is the hardest substance known, but on the other hand, it's translucent and light can pass through it, and so on. Well, once you've done this, you have your sumkor, your magical circle. Then you do the yeshewapa. This is calling down the higher spiritual energies into the precincts of your mandala. And again, you invoke the Buddhas of the three times, who are symbolically up there in heaven, and their spiritual energies, chinlap or blessings, descend like rays of light into the precincts of your mandala, which is inside your magical circle. And then the last task you have to do is to consecrate the puja offerings you will use in the course of the sadhana. And if you're going to have a tantric feast or Gana Puja afterwards, you also have many offerings which will be used at that point, and also they will be partaken by, in terms of food and drink, by the participants in the tantric feast. So something like a party, which could also include singing and dancing and song. So that is all in the mudra, or the preliminaries to the sadhana. So you have that invoking of spirits, like we have in ceremonial magic and like in Wicca and so on. And then you have what would correspond to the drawing down of the moon with Wicca, where the leading officiant or the Vajracharya who's doing the ritual or the sadhana transforms into the Idam meditation deity, which can be a male deity or a female deity. And then when you're doing this as a meditation, you are creating for yourself a virtual reality. I mean, people nowadays are very much into these video games and so on. They've been doing, even before that, role-playing games and so on. Well, here it's all combined in your tantric sadhana meditation, because you are not outside looking at the action on a screen in front of you. You are in the center of the action. You find yourself inside this sacred space, which is the mandala, and you are seeing everything happening there through the eyes of the Idam. So you are the director. You're creating your own soap opera here. You're telling all these other figures, which have, of course, their symbolic meaning in terms of different mental processes and so on, what to do. And so a drama happens inside here, which is like a royal court. And you first are doing this as a visualization. And what is visualized are known as samyasattva, the symbolic beings. But they are something created by your mind. And although in this present life you may be very beautiful and so on, still your mind has its limitations. But nevertheless, what you are visualizing is a pure vision. So at the same time, it acts as a pure receptacle for the invocation of the spirit, of the higher spiritual powers to descend into your visualization, what was called by the ancient Greeks, theurgia. And so you're calling down the celestial energies into the image. The ancient Egyptian priests would make a clay image or a wooden image or whatever in front, and then they would do the ritual meditation and call down the higher spiritual energies to enter into it, to enliven and ensoul it, so then you could enter into a dialogue with it and receive prophecies of the future and so on. Well, here you're doing something similar, but the image isn't a statue you make, it's your visualization. And so your visualization becomes the residence for the spirit that you invoke to descend into it. Now, of course, when your visualization includes yourself, this is something like spirit possession, and so you can have phenomena similar to that, but it's more like what they call in California channeling, where you haven't exited your body and a spirit just moves into it. No, you're aware still of being you, looking like the Idam meditation deity, but also feeling the spirit of either meditation deity dwelling in you with all its powers, capacities, wisdoms, and so on. And so then you have you practice self-empowerment, and you see the 5 deities of initiation appear above your head, bearing these flasks or vases of initiation, and they pour the contents, which look like luminous waters, onto the crown of your head. Passes down your central channel through all your chakras and channels and so on. Filling your entire body, you become luminous and filled with light and so on. And you also greet the descent of the spirits like they are honored guests, but they're also, the spirits in you. So then how do you make offerings to yourself as an honored guest? So you project out of your heart rays of light which manifest in front of you as 8 or 16 puja devis. And they are dancing and singing. They're very beautiful and scantily clad and attractive and so on. And they present various puja offerings. They're the traditional outer puja offerings, which were given in ancient times to honored guests who show up at the door of your house and so on. Then you have the inner puja offerings, which are a bit more wrathful, including nectars and torma cakes and so on. And then you have this is a high tantric practice, so there isn't any of this silly Puritanism to be found here. So then you have the secret offerings, and then the puja devis call in their boyfriends, the dakas, and they come dancing in, and they do this dance, and then they engage in sexual intercourse. And so the bliss experienced in sex, that's the secret offering here. And after all this activity, you then engage in the mantra recitations, which, as I was explaining before, you have seva, sadhana, karma, yoga. Now, the mantra recitation, mantra japa, first of all, functions to authenticate and stabilize your visualization, because all this activity is happening around you continuously, and you are the meditation deity, whether it's a single figure or in yab yom with a consort, so on. And when that energy becomes very powerful, then it can be projected. For example, you see the rays of light go out, and on the outer parts of your mandala, you have all the lesser guardian spirits, and the rays of light from your heart then strike their heart center, which then activates them and puts them into action. And then they go and start beating up on the bad guys who are everywhere and so on. Or accomplishing different functions and so on. And you see this happening while you're reciting the mantra, and you have the mala in the left hand and so on. And then when that all comes to a culmination, then you do the dissolution of the visualization and so on, which is part of the concluding part where the walls of the manda are absorbed into the secondary deities. They are absorbed into the principal deity. The principal deity is absorbed into the seed syllable in the heart, and then the seed syllable from the bottom gradually dissolves into just a point of light, which then is absorbed into empty space, and that's when you have the opportunity to find yourself in the state of contemplation, otherwise known as Dzogchen, because you have used up all this mental energy over a period of time while you've been creating this virtual reality for yourself. And suddenly you relax and stop. It's like you suddenly stop doing hard physical labor or some extreme sport, and you just collapse. And at that moment, your mind stops. And at that time, you have the potentiality to find yourself in the natural state of Dzogchen. But inevitably, then external stimuli return the sounds and sights, your environment, and so on. And then you enter into the post-meditation experience of the J-Top, and then you recite the dedication of merit, various aspiration prayers, benediction, or best wishes, like that. If you're doing a very big practice, you might then have many torma offerings to the various guardians of your tradition. For example, when we do such a puja practice in Stettin, we always invoke our local deity up there, Triglav, who was the god of the Vendish people who lived there before the Germans came and so on. And he had his temple quite near where our Gompa is. So we included him in our Buddhist practice. So we invoke, the Masa Damsum, the usual guardians of the Dzogchen teaching, but also Triglav, he gets there. And more recently, Santa Muerte has appeared, because I met her when I was visiting Houston, Texas, and she's the most popular goddess appearing on the Mexican-US border and so on. She's not just a patron of drug smugglers. She eliminates all kinds of problems and so on. So I'm into the Red Santa Muerte, and several people who have slept at night in the Gompa there have had visions of her. So she's a living power. And after that, we have the Gana Puja or tantric feast, which is considered an action practice. So it's not separated then from the sadhana, which is considered meditation practice. And the principal function of the Gana Puja is to repair broken samaya vows with the guru, with the Ida meditation deity, and with one's fellow Sangha members, because we're all Vajra brothers and sisters, more than Dharma brothers and sisters, because Vajra brothers and sisters have been initiated into the same mandala. But as you know, with human beings, there can always be misunderstandings, disagreements, bad temper, and things like this. What do you do to create good feelings again? You throw a big party. And so then you invite the various guests, the higher spiritual guests, the three roots of the gurus, devas, dakinis, which also includes Buddhas, bodhisattvas, and so on. And then secondly, the guardians who have the third eye of wisdom, you invoke them. And then the lower guests, there's the 8 classes of spirits, some of whom you may have karmic debts with because of actions committed in previous lives when you have killed them, either in battle or hunting them for food. If they remember you, then they are still pissed off at you and you have this karmic debt with them and they want to invoke karmic retribution upon you. So you apologize to them and you offer them the dharmas here and so on, and the other offerings. And then you have the guests of your compassion, who are the suffering beings, and the 6 lokas or destinies of rebirth among the devas, asuras, humans, animals, pretas, wandering ghosts, and denizens in hell, and the offerings to relieve their suffering. And so then there can be places here for some singing and dancing, and then the feasting on the offerings. And at the conclusion of the feasting, then some of the leftovers are taken outdoors to the lesser spirits who weren't invited into the mandala, and it's left for them to feast upon them, whether they are the local dogs or insects or whatever form they may appear in. And then there's some other things. There's also a offering made to the 12 mountain goddesses who guard Tibet. And then there's the wild horse dance of Hayagriva to subdue any remaining negative spirits and so on. And finally, you conclude again with a dedication of merit, aspiration prayers and benedictions or best wishes and so on. So that's a big practice, but you also have much shorter daily practices where you just can keep up your connection with some meditation practice for a particular yidam, if you have one, and so on. And it's a lot like that. So you have both meditation where you do transformation, but you also have the summoning of the spirits. So that we have in ceremonial magic.
You know, a couple of questions following from that. One of them is about tub. You mentioned this potency, this magical potency that one develops through sadhana and so on. I wonder, what is, if you might say, what is tub? What are its characteristics, or what is it? And how is it that sadhana develops that? If I think of physical potency, I can think of various dimensions: physical strength, perhaps physical endurance, and they enable me to do certain things with my body that others might not be able to do. And I can acquire those potencies by lifting weights and, jogging or whatever the case would be. I'm thinking that now also of, seeing as you mentioned Crowley, I'm thinking of the sorts of things he talks about: this ability, this sort of one-pointedness, with the ability to hold one's body in a certain position as a practice in, and also a result of a kind of certain equanimity or stability of mind and body and so on. I wonder if those have relevance here. So could you say something about what is tub and how is it developed through sadhana or any other means?
Tu means the capacity of your psychic power. It's your psychic energy. Now you have a certain amount of that just naturally, but it can also be cultivated and developed, just as we have our physical muscles, but through sports, lifting weights, dance exercises, martial arts, we can develop further capacity. So this is what we do with sadhana practice. The sadhana practice is a way for develop your magical or psychic powers, which are called tu, Tibetan.
And these, what are the signs of the development of tub, and what does it enable one to do in the magical or psychic realm?
There are signs, outer, inner, and secret. So certain outer signs may appear. Of course, you may just feel much better. That's a good sign. And you may feel more confident and able to do something. But there may be physical signs also, or material signs in your immediate environment, like you can actually make water boil. You know, if your mantra city develops to that extent. You may also find things suddenly working in your environment and attracting that. Like recently, I did a lot of practice of bettering my situation, and suddenly events just fell into place. Whereas a year ago, didn't look like that at all. And of course, it's important now that we are experiencing, well, here at Cerebus now, the three-headed dog of hell has appeared, and we have this superheat. And in the room here, it is now 28 degrees, but much worse down south in Italy or France, or with my friends in the US, where 28 degrees sounds cool compared to, 45 degrees or 49 degrees. And also, we have various social, political problems that the developed world seems to be becoming more and more insecure and so on. So developing our capacities to deal with that becomes very important. Also, in terms of inner signs, dreams are very important. And Tibetan texts will often list, okay, if you are developing your practice successfully, then certain signs appear as dreams, like seeing snow-clad mountains, or climbing up a mountain, or blooming flowers, seeing yourself in a red robe, or things like this may be signs of success. Also, then more secret level, you may come to understand things you didn't understand previously, or you may feel you are receiving communications from the Dakinis about what is happening in the, or can happen in the future. For example, years ago, it was 2018, I was doing meditation, and suddenly I felt the Dakinis were communicating to me, and they were telling me, okay, you guys now have 12 years, and then it will be more than a crisis, it will be a catastrophe if you don't do anything. Well, that seems to be happening. It's been getting hotter and hotter. So at my age, I have to be careful about the heat. I just can't go out running and jogging in the sunlight on a day like this or something. So various signs do appear. They've appeared in my own personal experience, but also from what I've heard from others, and so on. And of course, the Tibetan lamas have been very attuned to this in terms of their own culture. In the West, sometimes people tend to dismiss all of this and think, oh, things just go on the way they've always gone on. But they don't. Things are changing all the time, and they seem to be changing more rapidly nowadays.
Is this partly what explains some of the should we say, unusual capacities and unusual effects around the Gyalwa Karmapa, to take one example, who I think was famously very magical in many ways, and somebody who used
and
it.
I saw it myself. So.
Yes.
Yes, Karmapa. Oh yes, I mean, I've never seen somebody with such strong psychic energy, because he would sit there on a throne and he would just send it out like this. It was palpable. You could touch it. I mean, I saw him knock a holy needle on his ass, with just energy coming. He was, Karmapa was incredible. Yeah. As Jimmy Rigson Rinpoche used to say, the Karmapa is the king. Yes.
Well, I think we're approaching near the end of this episode. I must petition you, I think, for a triptych, a third.
Oh, sure. No problem.
Because we haven't even touched...
but otherwise, no problem.
Yeah. We haven't even touched the stories of your lamas. I'd like to ask about them, and particular lamas such as the Gyalwa Karmapa, but others, Gyalwa Karmapa too, but others too. Perhaps then to round out, and we might pick this up next time as well, you're talking about sadhana and these various practices. You've also investigated a great deal of Tibetan shamanism, exorcism, and soul retrieval, or sometimes called la hooking, that sort of thing. How does these practices and these capacities, how do they interact with exorcism and soul retrieval as it's understood in Tibetan shamanism and in the Nyingma school, etc.?
But when we do sadhana, this is the method to develop siddhi. And here there are two levels of siddhi. The ultimate spiritual siddhi is, of course, the ultimate spiritual goal of liberation from suffering and samsara and the attaining of Buddha enlightenment. But for most of us, that's a bit down the road. It's not tomorrow or the next day, probably not even our next life, and so on. But in the meantime, we need a little help from our friends. And so these more ordinary siddhis are very useful. Now, of course, they don't seem so ordinary to us if we start developing siddhis where we can do distant viewing, clairvoyance, or clairaudience, or telepathy. We suddenly know the thoughts of others, or remembering past lives, or attracting prosperity, and so on. But these are very useful on the path, because we are fallible human beings. We have to make a living. We have to deal with all the things that are in everyday life and so on. If we can develop our capacities that facilitate that, then this is something very positive. I think generally now, the medical profession has come to recognize that meditation practice can be very useful. We're not talking about religion at all, but very useful for reducing stress, getting people to relax, and all this. And so these benefits are not just restricted to Buddhist practitioners. They're open to everyone. Of course, this is sort of a part of my comparative interest, where I find similar things in different cultures and traditions and so on. And many of these things are not unique to Buddhism at all, but Buddhism has a very empirical emphasis, looking at what is our condition in life here and now, and what can we do about this to better our condition, to be more effective and so on. It isn't a matter of converting to some religion and exclusively worshiping this god or that god. The Buddha was not an atheist. He was not an agnostic. He admitted all the gods exist. And when it's useful to you, you can invoke them. You can offer puja to them. You can worship them if you want. So they don't have this obsession that the Jews had, whether we have our God and all those other gods over there, are evil or don't exist. So all the gods exist that people believe in because they're products of their belief and represent then their own psychic energy. And we live in this collective envelope of energy around the earth, which is generated by all the living beings who are found upon this planet and so on. So what's important is we have this intercultural dialogue and so on. Is that dialogue, you're not selling something, you're not trying to convert somebody. I don't care about converting the whole world to Buddhism or this, but you can find things in various traditions that can interrelate and so on. So I'm definitely in favor of multilingualism and multiculturalism and so on.
Well, this has been so fascinating. Thank you very much. And
Okay.
I look forward to the third, and perhaps in that episode we can pick up
All right.
this theme of exorcism and soul retrieval or la hooking, and also discuss your various lamas and so on. That would be very cool indeed.
Okay.
John Myrdhin Reynolds, Lama Vajranatha, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Guru Viking. Namaste.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.